October 12, 1944. 30,000 feet above Leyte Gulf, Lieutenant Yukio Seki adjusted his flight goggles and gazed at the formation of 24 aircraft surrounding him. The morning sun reflected off their polished fuselages, each plane carrying a single 500-pound payload beneath its belly. His squadron believed they were about to execute the most devastating tactical innovation in naval warfare. They believed wrong. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What these young Japanese aviators didn't know was that American scientists had already developed a technological response so revolutionary that within 6 months, 9 out of every 10 suicide aircraft would be intercepted before reaching their targets, transforming what seemed like an unstoppable weapon into a catastrophic miscalculation that would help seal Japan's fate in the Pacific. Lieutenant Seki was 23 years old, a graduate of the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy with 170 flight hours in his logbook. He had volunteered for the Special Attack Unit 3 weeks earlier, inspired by Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi's speech about the sacred wind that would sweep the American fleet from Philippine waters. The term Kamikaze, borrowed from the divine typhoons that destroyed Mongol invasion fleets in 1274 and 1281, carried profound historical weight. Seki and his fellow pilots saw themselves as modern embodiments of samurai spirit, willing to trade their lives for strategic victory. The mathematics seemed compelling. A conventional bombing attack required dozens of aircraft, consumed enormous fuel resources, and faced increasingly effective American defensive fire. Success rates had plummeted to below 5% in recent engagements, but a pilot who guided his aircraft directly into a target became a precision-guided weapon, theoretically unstoppable once committed to the final dive. Japanese military planners calculated that even if only 20% of suicide attacks succeeded, they would inflict unsustainable losses on the American fleet, potentially forcing negotiations before an invasion of the Japanese home islands became feasible. On October 25th, Seki led 5 aircraft toward an American escort carrier group off Samar Island. His Zero fighter, stripped of armor and ammunition to maximize speed and fuel, handled differently than he remembered from training. The engine roared as he pushed the throttle forward, gaining altitude to commence his attack dive. Below, the white wakes of American vessels created geometric patterns across the blue water. Seki selected his target, a carrier whose flight deck bristled with aircraft, and nosed into a steep descent. What happened next would be documented in the after-action report of USS White Plains. The carrier's radar operators detected the incoming aircraft at 18 miles. Standard protocol called for launching fighter patrols and preparing anti-aircraft batteries. But on this particular morning, the ship was testing a new weapons system that had arrived 3 weeks earlier in unmarked crates, accompanied by technicians who spoke in hushed tones about revolutionary capabilities. The new system was the VT fuse, officially designated as the Mark 53 proximity fuse, though most sailors simply called it the secret weapon. Development had begun in 1940 at the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, requiring the miniaturization of radar components into a package small enough to fit inside an artillery shell, yet rugged enough to withstand the 17,000 times gravity acceleration of being fired from a 5-inch gun. The technological challenges were staggering. Engineers had to create vacuum tubes smaller than anyone had previously manufactured, design circuits that could function for the few seconds of flight time, and incorporate safety mechanisms to prevent premature detonation. The fuse worked by transmitting radio waves and measuring their reflection off nearby objects. When an aircraft came within 70 feet, the changing frequency of reflected waves triggered detonation, creating a lethal sphere of shrapnel that didn't require a direct hit. Traditional time delay fuses required gunners to estimate target altitude, speed, and trajectory, then calculate the precise moment of detonation. Human error meant that perhaps one shell in 1,000 actually exploded near its target. The proximity fuse eliminated this uncertainty entirely. Lieutenant Commander Robert Williams stood in White Plains Combat Information Center, watching the radar screen paint green lines with each sweep. The incoming aircraft appeared as bright dots, descending rapidly. Williams had participated in the proximity fuse trials at Dahlgren Proving Ground in Virginia, where the new ammunition achieved hit rates exceeding 90% against drone targets. But those had been controlled tests in favorable conditions. This would be the first combat deployment against a determined enemy employing suicidal tactics. He gave the order to commence firing. The 5-inch guns swung toward their calculated intercept points, their crews loading shells marked with distinctive yellow bands. Fire control computers, mechanical marvels of rotating cams and differential gears, solved the geometric problems of where a shell needed to be positioned in three-dimensional space to intersect with an aircraft traveling at 280 miles per hour. The first salvo left the barrels with a thunderous roar, the shells climbing toward their targets at 2,000 feet per second. Secchi never saw the explosion that tore his aircraft apart. One moment, he was focused on the growing silhouette of the carrier, lining up his angle of attack. The next moment, a proximity-fused shell detonated 43 feet from his starboard wing. 730 steel fragments, each traveling at velocities exceeding 3,000 feet per second, shredded the Zero's control surfaces and severed the main fuel line. The aircraft disintegrated in a bright orange fireball 1,200 feet above the water. Of the 5 aircraft in Secchi's formation, 4 were intercepted before reaching the carrier group. The 5th, flown by Petty Officer Nobuo Tani, managed to penetrate the defensive screen by approaching at wave-top altitude, below the effective range of radar detection. He struck the escort carrier USS St. Lo at 10:47 in the morning, his 500-pound payload detonating in the hangar deck and triggering secondary explosions among stored aviation fuel and ordnance. The St. Lo sank 30 minutes later, the first American carrier lost to kamikaze attack. But even as Japanese commanders celebrated this tactical success, they failed to grasp the technological revolution that was already rendering their suicide tactics obsolete. The single carrier lost represented a success rate of 20%, exactly what planners had predicted. What they couldn't know was that this would represent the high-water mark of kamikaze effectiveness. As proximity fuses became standard ammunition aboard every American vessel in the Pacific Fleet, the mathematics of the campaign would shift dramatically against Japan. By November of 1944, American ammunition production had converted entirely to proximity-fused shells for anti-aircraft purposes. The manufacturing challenge was immense. Each fuse required 4 vacuum tubes, 19 capacitors, numerous resistors and coils, plus the battery and switch mechanisms. The tubes themselves were technological marvels, with filaments thinner than human hair and glass envelopes the size of a thumb. RCA, Raytheon and Sylvania converted their radio tube production lines to manufacture millions of these specialized components. The security surrounding the proximity fuse was absolute. President Franklin Roosevelt had personally designated it as one of 3 technologies, along with radar and the Atomic Research Program, that required the highest classification level. Shells were never to be fired over enemy-controlled land, where duds might be recovered and reverse-engineered. Ships' crews were forbidden from discussing the ammunition's capabilities. Even the crates were designed to look identical to conventional ordnance packaging. The Japanese High Command had intelligence reports about improved American anti-aircraft effectiveness, but they attributed it to better training and increased gun density rather than a revolutionary new technology. Ensign Kiyoshi Ogawa was 19 years old when he reported to Kanoya Air Base in Kyushu for kamikaze training in January 1945. He had been a university student studying mechanical engineering before the military draft interrupted his education. Unlike earlier volunteers who had embraced the suicide mission with genuine fervor, Ogawa harbored private doubts. He had read enough about American industrial capacity to understand that Japan was losing the war of production. His diary, recovered after the war from his family home, reveals a young man torn between duty and despair. The training program at Kanoya lasted only 3 weeks. Pilots practiced approach angles and dive techniques, but there was no instruction on evasive maneuvers or combat tactics. The entire philosophy centered on reaching the target and completing the attack, regardless of defensive fire. Instructors emphasized spiritual preparation over tactical sophistication. Pilots received ceremonial headbands inscribed with patriotic slogans, wrote farewell letters to their families, and participated in sake ceremonies the night before missions. On March 21st, Ogawa climbed into the cockpit of a Yokosuka D-4Y dive bomber loaded with an 1,800-pound armor-piercing payload. His target was the American fleet supporting the invasion of Okinawa, the largest kamikaze operation of the war. Operation Tengo called for sending 1,500 aircraft in waves against the invasion force, hoping to inflict losses so severe that the Americans would abandon the assault. The reality Ogawa encountered off Okinawa bore little resemblance to the scenarios described in training. The American fleet had arranged itself in concentric defensive rings, with radar picket destroyers stationed up to 60 miles from the main body. These smaller vessels, equipped with the latest radar sets and bristling with 5-inch guns loaded exclusively with proximity-fused ammunition, served as early warning stations and sacrificial shields to protect the high-value carriers and battleships behind them. Radar operators aboard the destroyer USS Laffey detected Ogawa's formation at 43 miles, long before Japanese pilots could see the American vessels. The Combat Information Center transmitted tracking data to fire control systems on 6 surrounding destroyers, coordinating their defensive fire to create overlapping kill zones. As the Japanese aircraft closed to 20 miles, the sky ahead of them began to fill with black bursts of shrapnel, each explosion marking a proximity fuse detonation. The psychological impact on the Japanese pilots was devastating. Traditional anti-aircraft fire required visual sighting and produced relatively sparse shell bursts that pilots could attempt to evade. But proximity fuses created a nearly continuous curtain of explosions, each one deadly within a 70-foot radius. Pilots who tried to maintain formation found themselves flying through multiple blast zones. Those who broke formation and attempted evasive maneuvers simply exposed themselves to fire from different directions. Ogawa watched 3 aircraft from his formation disintegrate within seconds. A 4th, piloted by his friend from university, simply disappeared in a blinding flash. The bomber's controls felt sluggish as Ogawa tried to maintain his approach angle, while also dodging the expanding wall of explosions. Shrapnel rattled against his fuselage like hail on a tin roof. A proximity burst 70 feet to port peppered the aircraft with fragment strikes, severing hydraulic lines and puncturing the starboard fuel tank. He made the decision that saved his life. Rather than continuing toward the distant carriers, he selected the nearest destroyer and committed to his dive. The choice reflected both tactical reality and profound demoralization. The massive carriers that represented primary targets were simply unreachable through the defensive fire. Better to strike any target than fail entirely. The destroyers' close-in weapons, 40mm and 20mm guns, added their fire to the 5-inch batteries. These smaller weapons couldn't accommodate proximity fuses due to space constraints, but at close range their volume of fire created nearly solid streams of tracers. Ogawa's aircraft shuddered under multiple impacts. One wing developed a jagged tear. Smoke poured from the engine cowling, but momentum and gravity carried him forward. He struck the Laffey amidships at 3:47 in the afternoon, the 18th aircraft to attack the destroyer that day. The ship survived, though damage control teams fought fires for 2 hours. Of the 18 attacking aircraft, proximity-fused shells had intercepted 14 before they could complete their attacks. The Laffey's experience was repeated across the fleet. Of 230 kamikaze aircraft launched that day, only 19 succeeded in striking their targets, a success rate of 8.2%. The pattern held throughout the Okinawa campaign. Between April and June 1945, Japanese forces launched approximately 1,900 suicide sorties against the American fleet. Naval records indicate that proximity-fused ammunition intercepted over 1,700 of these aircraft before they could reach their targets, an effectiveness rate exceeding 90%. The few that penetrated the defensive screen generally struck smaller vessels like destroyers and patrol craft, rather than the carriers and battleships they'd been intended to sink. The cost to Japan was catastrophic. Each kamikaze pilot represented years of training and resources. The aircraft themselves, even stripped-down versions, embodied thousands of hours of manufacturing labor and precious materials like aluminum and aviation fuel. Sending 1,900 aircraft on one-way missions meant permanently removing them from the defensive reserve needed to counter the anticipated invasion of Japan itself. American casualties were certainly significant. 34 ships were sunk and 368 damaged during the Okinawa campaign. Nearly 5,000 sailors perished, but these losses, while tragic, were sustainable for a nation producing warships at a rate of dozens per month. For Japan, the Kamikaze campaign represented an unrecoverable expenditure of irreplaceable resources with diminishing returns. Captain Minoru Genda, one of the principal architects of the Pearl Harbor attack, reviewed casualty reports in May 1945 from his position at Naval General Headquarters in Tokyo. The statistics told a story of tactical failure. Early kamikaze operations in October and November 1944 had achieved success rates approaching 20%. By December, this had dropped to 15%. January saw 12%. By April, the rate had collapsed to less than 9%. Genda requested detailed interrogations of the few pilots who had survived aborted missions due to mechanical failures or weather. Their testimony consistently described unprecedented anti-aircraft effectiveness, shells that seemed to know when aircraft were near, explosions that required no direct hit to destroy a plane, a defensive screen so dense that penetration seemed impossible. Intelligence analysts speculated about the cause. Some suggested the Americans had developed new radar-guided weapons. Others thought improved computing systems had enhanced fire control accuracy. A few proposed that the shells themselves contained some form of detection mechanism, but this seemed technologically implausible. How could a small projectile fired from a gun contain working electronics? The truth, had they known it, would have confirmed their worst suspicions about American technological superiority. The proximity fuse represented exactly the kind of sophisticated engineering that Japan's industrial base could no longer match. American factories were producing 20,000 fuses per day by mid-1945, each one containing components that required precision manufacturing tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The fuses underwent rigorous testing, with rejection rates below 2%. They functioned reliably in conditions ranging from Arctic cold to tropical heat, withstanding the shock of gun launch and maintaining accuracy throughout their flight. Japanese industry, by contrast, was collapsing under the weight of strategic bombing and resource shortages. Factories that had produced aircraft engines now struggled to maintain production due to lack of aluminum, skilled workers, and electrical power. Quality control had deteriorated to the point where newly manufactured aircraft often required extensive repairs before they could fly. The idea of mass-producing millions of sophisticated electronic devices was simply beyond the capability of Japan's shattered industrial infrastructure. Seaman First Class William Morrison served as a loader on the No. 3 5-inch gun mount aboard the carrier USS Bunker Hill. He had enlisted in January 1942 at age 17, lying about his age, because he wanted to contribute to the war effort after Pearl Harbor. By May 1945, he was a combat veteran of 7 major engagements, and he'd developed a profound respect for the proximity-fused ammunition his gun fired. Morrison could distinguish the yellow-banded shells by feel even in the dark, carefully loading them into the gun's breech during night action stations. He'd seen conventional time-delay fuses in action during the Solomon Islands campaign, watching shells burst harmlessly in empty sky while enemy aircraft flew through untouched. The proximity rounds were different. Almost every shot that came near an aircraft resulted in a violent explosion and falling debris. On May 11th, Morrison was at his station when radar detected incoming aircraft at 22 miles. The Bunker Hill was conducting flight operations, vulnerable with aircraft on deck being fueled and armed. The gun crew went through their practiced routine, loading, aiming, firing in rhythm coordinated by the fire control director. Morrison counted 18 rounds expended before the first aircraft exploded at 12,000 feet. A bright orange flash, followed by tumbling wreckage. 2 more aircraft fell to proximity fire. A 4th made it through the defensive screen, approached from an unexpected angle where the carrier's own superstructure blocked some gun positions. The pilot struck the flight deck at 10:30 in the morning, his fuel and payload detonating among the armed aircraft parked there. Secondary explosions ripped through the ship. Aviation fuel poured across the deck and ignited, creating walls of flame. Morrison survived because the No. 3 mount was positioned away from the initial impact. But 393 of his shipmates died in the attack. The Bunker Hill, though she remained afloat, was so severely damaged that she never returned to combat operations. The Kamikaze had succeeded, but only because he'd approached from an angle that reduced the effectiveness of proximity-fused fire. The attack became a case study in defensive positioning. Naval tacticians studied the approach angle, identifying blind spots in the concentric defensive arrangement. Subsequent fleet formations adjusted ship positioning to eliminate these vulnerabilities, creating overlapping fields of fire that left no approach vector undefended by proximity-fused weapons. Lieutenant Junior Grade Haro Araki flew his final mission on August 9, 1945, one of the last kamikaze sorties launched before Japan's surrender. He departed from Oita Air Base at dawn, part of a formation of 7 aircraft assigned to attack Allied shipping near Okinawa. His diary, written the night before and mailed to his parents, expressed neither enthusiasm nor despair, only a kind of resigned acceptance. Araki had studied physics at Kyoto University before the draft. He understood electromagnetic radiation, radio waves, and basic electronics. As he flew toward his target, he found himself analyzing the defensive fire from a scientific perspective. The shells seemed to burst at consistent altitudes, creating a pattern too regular for manual fuse setting. The explosions occurred even when aircraft took evasive action, suggesting some form of automatic triggering mechanism. In his final moments, as proximity-fused shells began exploding around his aircraft, Araki may have realized what technology was intercepting him. The understanding would have carried bitter irony. He'd spent his university years studying the very principles now being used to end his life. American scientists had weaponized concepts he'd learned in lecture halls, creating a system so sophisticated that his sacrifice would almost certainly be meaningless. His aircraft was intercepted at 8,000 feet, 43 miles from the nearest American vessel. The proximity fuse had performed exactly as designed. The strategic implications of the proximity fuse extended far beyond the immediate tactical success rate. Japanese military leadership had based their entire defensive strategy for the home islands on the assumption that kamikaze attacks would inflict unsustainable casualties on any invasion fleet. Intelligence estimates suggested Japan had assembled approximately 10,000 aircraft in reserve for this final defense, along with recruiting and training thousands of pilots for suicide missions. The plan called for waves of attacks that would overwhelm American defenses through sheer numbers. Planners calculated that even with 50% interception rates, 5,000 successful strikes would cripple the invasion force. The calculation seemed reasonable, based on early kamikaze effectiveness, but the proximity fuse had fundamentally changed the mathematics. By August 1945, American analysts had compiled comprehensive statistics on kamikaze operations. The data showed that proximity-fused ammunition achieved interception rates averaging 92% across all engagement types. Against massed attacks, where multiple shells could be directed at each target, the effectiveness approached 95%. The implications were clear. Japan's reserve of 10,000 aircraft would result in perhaps 800 successful attacks, distributed across a fleet of thousands of vessels. The strategy that seemed like a potential war winner in October 1944 had become a recipe for futile sacrifice by August 1945. This realization influenced the decision-making process that led to Japan's surrender. While the atomic attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki certainly played a crucial role, the demonstrated futility of kamikaze tactics removed what many military leaders had considered their most potent remaining weapon. The divine wind that was supposed to destroy the American fleet had been neutralized by American technology and industrial might. The proximity fuse remained classified until after the war. When details finally became public, German scientists expressed astonishment that such sophisticated electronics had been miniaturized and mass-produced. Japanese engineers, studying captured examples, calculated that replicating the technology would have required their entire remaining industrial capacity devoted exclusively to fuse production for months, even if they'd possessed the theoretical knowledge. Post-war analysis determined that proximity-fused ammunition had intercepted approximately 19,000 Japanese aircraft during the war's final year, the vast majority being kamikaze attackers. If those aircraft had achieved even the early 20% success rate, they would have sunk hundreds of additional vessels and inflicted tens of thousands more casualties. The proximity fuse had, quite literally, saved the lives of thousands of American servicemen while simultaneously dooming Japanese pilots to futile deaths. Survivors from both sides carried different memories of the technology. American gunners recalled the satisfaction of seeing their fire consistently intercept attackers, the confidence that came from knowing their weapons were devastatingly effective. Japanese pilots who survived aborted missions, and later prisoners of war, described the terror of flying into what seemed like impenetrable walls of explosions, the helpless feeling of being hunted by shells that needed only to come close to destroy. The broader lesson transcended the specific technology. The Kamikaze campaign represented Japan's attempt to leverage human courage and willingness to sacrifice as a substitute for industrial and technological capability. The proximity fuse demonstrated that in modern warfare, industrial capacity and technological sophistication ultimately trumped individual heroism. No amount of dedication could overcome the simple mathematical reality of 90% interception rates. The young men who flew these missions believed they were participating in a sacred duty that would save their nation. Lieutenant Seki, Ensign Ogawa, Lieutenant Araki, and thousands like them climbed into their aircraft, genuinely convinced their sacrifice would matter. They couldn't know that American scientists working in laboratories had already rendered their tactics obsolete. They couldn't know that the divine wind they believed would sweep away the enemy was about to be dispersed by electromagnetic fields and vacuum tubes smaller than a finger. In the decades after the war, proximity fuses became standard technology in every major military. The principles pioneered during World War II evolved into sophisticated systems that could track multiple targets simultaneously, distinguish between aircraft and decoys, and coordinate defensive fire across entire fleets. The kamikaze attacks and the technological response they provoked changed naval warfare forever, shifting the balance decisively toward defensive systems. The human cost was staggering. Approximately 4,000 Japanese pilots died in kamikaze attacks, most of them intercepted before reaching their targets. American casualties, while significant, were far lower than they would have been without proximity fuses. The technology saved lives on both sides by making the attacks less effective and thereby hastening the war's end. The story of the Kamikaze campaign and the proximity fuse represents one of World War II's clearest examples of how technological innovation could decisively influence tactical outcomes. It demonstrates the tremendous advantage possessed by the side with superior industrial capacity and scientific resources. And it serves as a reminder that courage and sacrifice, while admirable, cannot overcome fundamental disparities in technological capability. The young Japanese pilots who flew into American defensive fire were not cowards or fanatics. They were ordinary young men responding to extraordinary circumstances, doing what their culture and military training demanded. Their tragedy was not lack of bravery, but being sent on missions rendered nearly suicidal by technology they didn't know existed and couldn't counter. The proximity fuse didn't just intercept aircraft. It exposed the fatal weakness of Japan's entire strategic position, the inability to match American innovation and production, even when fighting for national survival. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.